Hi everyone, I'm Jack Thremling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Sardonicus by Ray Russell. And this is a marvelous Gothic story. Russell was writing in the middle of the 20th century, and there's a couple of crucial ways in which he betrays that perspective. But he's so steeped in the classical Gothic tradition that it all works. He's very much constructing a taller tower on the bones of an old castle, or perhaps he's digging a deeper dungeon. But as I said, it all works. It's very much a story that holds up just like that old castle. Russell is referencing writers like Walpole, Maturin, Radcliffe. He's moving forward and advancing on writers like Poe or Henry James, even Bram Stoker's Dracula. And so he's taking all those influences from the early Romantic Gothic tradition through the Victorian Gothic and emerging in the 20th century. He's able to be a little bit more explicit than some of those writers. And to say some of the pieces that were left unsaid in some of those earlier stories, but he's never gory. He's never moving so wildly into the grand guignol in this story that it all emerges as this beautifully updated, pristine classical Gothic story. And I think it's crucial to say that Sardonicus doesn't exist as a story without the insights into psychology, into the human mind from individuals like William James or Sigmund Freud. That's all very evident in his writing, but it's just a marvelous story. We have Sir Robert Cargrave, a British physician living in London in the 1840s, perhaps 1850. You have to be very aware of Verdi's operas if you want the specific date, because it's never quite given. And things aren't just fully fleshed out. It's all very much sketched. The crucial details are given to us, but the rest isn't necessarily relevant, just like those great horror stories. But Russell gives us Sir Robert Cargrave, who receives this mysterious letter with this ornate curly-Q Rococo S on it. And he's eminent physician of some ability, and he's invited to visit this castle in Bohemia, in Central Europe. Perhaps he can avail this Mr. Sardonicus of some of his medical skill, because it turns out that Mr. Sardonicus has apparently married a woman that Cargrave knew when he was a little bit younger, and perhaps he liked her. He doesn't seem to admit that at the beginning, but we'll see. So he travels there to Bohemia, and this is how the castle is described. I sighed, for the desolate landscape and the thought of what might prove a holiday devoid of refreshing instant had combined to cloak my already wearied spirit in a melancholic humor. It was when I was in this condition that Castle Sardonicus met my eye, a dense, hunched outline at first. Then, with an instantaneous flicker of moonlight, a great, gaping death's head, the sight of which made me inhale sharply. With the exhalation, I chuckled at myself. Come, Sir Robert, I inwardly chided. It is, after all, but a castle, and you are not a green girl who starts at shadows and quails at midnight stories. The castle is situated at the terminus of a long and upward winding mountain road. It presents a somewhat forbidding aspect to the world, for there is little about it to suggest gaiety or warmth, or any of those qualities that might assure the wayfarer of welcome. Rather, this vast edifice of stone exudes an austerity, cold and repellent, a hint of ancient mysteries long buried, in a fluvium of medieval dankness and decay. At night, and most particularly on nights when the moon is slim or cloud enshrouded, it is a heavy blot upon the horizon, a shadow only, without features save for its many turreted outline. And should the moon be temporarily released from her cloudy confinement, her fugitive rays lend scant comfort, for they but serve to throw the castle into sudden, startling chiaroscuro, its windows fleetingly assuming the appearance of sightless, though all-seeing orbs, its portcullis becoming for an instant a gaping mouth, its entire form striking the physical and the mental eye, as with the sight of a gigantic skull. Classical Gothic indeed. And so Sir Robert is writing about this frightening castle, and he's able to go in. He meets with this woman, he reconnects with her, and with Maud, and he starts to admit perhaps that he did have stronger feelings for her once, long ago in London, before she had married Mr. Sardonicus. And then he meets Mr. Sardonicus, who is quite frightening, a very effective villain. And not just because of the appearance, for Mr. Sardonicus is permanently smiling. And it's not as if he's been disfigured or mutilated in some way. It's as if his muscles are forced back into this perpetual grin, to smile forever. And that becomes the whole point of the medical skill of Sir Robert Cargrave, is can he figure out some way to relax the muscles so that Mr. Sardonicus can smile normally, or frown, or adopt any facial expression, rather than to forever be trapped in this smile. But there's this that there's this sinister aspect to Mr. Sardonicus that unfolds as the story develops. But there's this way in which he confronts Sir Robert and sort of mocks not just Sir Robert and his sense of English honor, but rather, in addition to that, he's also mocking, in a sense, the entire Gothic tradition. I think Russell's doing this with this passage where he notes, "You used the word ghoulish a few minutes ago, Sir Robert," said Sardonicus. "It is one of those words one uses so easily in conversation. One utters it without stopping to think of its meaning. But in my opinion, it is not a word to be used lightly. When one uses it, one should have in one's mind a firm, unwavering picture of a ghoul." "Perhaps I did," I said. "Perhaps," he admitted, "and perhaps not. Let us obtain a precise definition of the word." And he finds it in the dictionary. And he goes, "Among Eastern nations, an imaginary evil being who robs graves and feeds upon corpses. One might say, then, that he gooms," a word he had defined earlier, to hunt for game in the dark. Sardonicus chuckled. He returned to his chair and helped himself to more brandy. "When you described Iago's actions as ghoulish," he continued, "did you think of him as the inhabitant of an Eastern nation, or an imaginary being as against the reality of Othello and Desdemona? And did you mean seriously to suggest that it was his custom to rob graves, and then to feed upon the disgusting nourishment he found therein?" "I used the word in a figurative sense," I replied. "Ah," said Sardonicus, "that is because you are English and do not believe in ghouls. Were you a Middle European, as am I, you would believe in their existence and would not be tempted to use the word other than literally. In my country, I was born in Poland. We understood such things. I, in point of fact, have known a ghoul." He paused for a moment and looked at me, then said, "You English are so blasé. Nothing shocks you. I sit here and tell you a thing of dreadful import, and you do not even blink your eyes. Can it be because you do not believe me?" And I think there's a way in which Russell is using Mr. Sardonicus' argument about ghouls with Sir Robert to sort of probe at the idea of the Gothic tradition, to suggest that some of these writers certainly did not believe in any supernatural incidences. Certainly did not believe in the folklore and the superstition, that they would scoff at. And certainly later writers started to emerge with the scientific advances of the 19th and early 20th century to firmly reject the supernatural and to firmly reject superstition. And so Russell is writing this story and giving the villain a chance to sort of poke at the hero, but also the readers, and suggest, is there something that, like, do you believe this story? Is this story scarier if you don't believe it or if you do? And there's a way in which he's going to resolve that question. But I think it's a crucial question in horror fiction is does the writer and does the reader believe that anything horrifying happens outside of what can happen in the natural world, in the material world? And there's a way I think Russell is really pushing at that, not just in Sardonicus, but in a number of his other stories. And he does it so effectively. And so I'll share one final passage. I don't want to necessarily go into the plot and spoil that for folks who haven't read the story, but it is a very good, strong Gothic story. He talks about, at one point, Sardonicus, "As I wandered the rural roads, my mind sought the cause of the affliction that had been visited upon me. Though but a country lad, I had read much, and I had a blunt, rational mind that was not susceptible to the easy explanations of the supernatural. I would not believe that God had placed a malediction upon me to punish me for my act. I would not believe that some black force from beyond the grave had reached out to stamp my face. At length, I began to believe it was the massive shock that had forced my face to its present state, and that my great guilt had helped to shape it." He goes on, "Strong powers, shock and guilt, not from God above or the fiend below, but from within my own breast, my own brain, my own soul." And that then introduces this crucial idea. They quote from Shakespeare's Macbeth to each other, where the idea is that the problem, the address and the cure for this ill is within yourself. There's some psychological aspect manifesting itself in pushing out and revealing itself. And that is where Sir Robert believes Sardonicus is actually having his issue. And Sardonicus suggests perhaps that's where it has been, in his own words. But how that is resolved is quite interesting. And I think it's a very strong Gothic story. And there's a couple of layers of twists that really work across the story to reveal and sort of maintain aspects of the Gothic tradition, but allow Russell to have that conflict, not just between the characters, but between the different traditions of Gothic, whether it can be supernatural or materialistic. I'll add that one piece of the story that I think advances into the 20th century is not just, in addition to the psychology that's very clearly from James and Freud and such, but is also the idea that the threats that are made about Maud become more explicit. In other earlier works, we might hear that something bad is going to happen to the heroine. We kind of know what that is, but Sardonicus actually becomes very explicit about what he will do, and he doesn't go into graphic detail, but he's much more explicit than we would have found in a story from the 1840s or in a story from the 1890s. And that, I think, again, allows Russell to sort of advance the Gothic tradition in an interesting way. So I think it's a great story. I have it collected in the Haunted Castles and Other Gothic Stories, published by Penguin Classics. But Russell wrote other works. I will note that Sagittarius is by far my favorite of Russell's stories, and I'll probably do a video on that in the near future. But he also wrote a short novel called The Case Against Satan, which fits into the tradition, again, of sort of works, both books and films, like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. There's ways in which Poe was an enormous influence on Russell, and I think Russell took Poe's ideas, but the fluid nature of his language is far beyond sort of where Poe was at, where Poe sometimes can't write out of his own way. Russell is able to advance and develop a story very fluidly. Henry James is a huge totem, I think, as well for Russell. The somewhat contemporary writer would have been Shirley Jackson. Certainly, I would say her novel, We've Always Lived in the Castle, probably feels the closest to sort of a Gothic masterpiece from her. I mentioned, of course, Dracula from Bram Stoker. The whole idea of an Englishman traveling into Central or Eastern Europe and how he experiences that. There aren't a bunch of comments on how spicy the food is. But otherwise, there are certain motifs that I think work across both of those. Another work might be The Other by Thomas Tryon. And certainly a later writer who sort of advanced her own ideas in the Gothic tradition and particularly took on these feminist aspects would be Angela Carter. And then there are writers like Richard Matheson, other writers who are collected in the American Supernatural Tales that sort of have their ways in which they push forward what we think of in horror fiction. But there are also the ways in which I think Gothic horror reflects certain aspects of the Romantic tradition, and specifically in poetry. So there are writers like Blake, Shelley, Keats, who have elements of Gothic in their poetry. Byron, Robert Browning would do that later on. And even outside of the explicitly Romantic tradition, writers like, I would say, Rimbaud or Verlaine, there are ways in which the conflict, the writer's conflict pushes out in a way that feels close to specifically the Gothic romances, the idea that there are things we desire that perhaps become dangerous for us. There are things that we demand that are outside of what society structure allows, and what that can mean. And it stretches far beyond, far earlier, in works like The Love Thief by Bilhana. I think an Indian poet from centuries earlier gets at that same exact idea. A writer like Theophile Gautier with his My Fantoms, I think, draws into that. Someone like Ladislav Klimo would be writing a comparably Gothic work in the 20th century that's far more graphic, far more horrifying and explicit, and it's satire, but it's satire that makes your stomach churn. Then there would be other writers who are influenced by the idea of the perpetual, terrifying smile. The Joker comes from that tradition, and the silent film The Man Who Laughs, based on a work by Victor Hugo, and of course The Black Dahlia by James Ellroy. Finally, when I think of terrifying princes out on the estates in Europe, the narrator in the second half of Gargoyles would come into mind. And of course, Freud with On Dreams comes to mind with his very explicit influence, I think, on Russell. So let me know if you've read this one. Let me know if you have other Gothic stories that you love. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.